Because understanding great literature is better than trying to read and understand yet another business book. On the Leadership Lessons from the Great Books podcast, we commit to reading, dissecting, and analyzing the great books of the Western canon. You know, those books, from Jane Austen to Shakespeare, and everything else in between, that you might have fallen asleep trying to read in high school. We do this for our listeners, the owner, the entrepreneur, the manager, or the civic leader who doesn't have the time to read, dissect, analyze, and leverage insights from literature to execute leadership best practices in the confusing and chaotic postmodern world we all now inhabit. Welcome to the rescuing of Western civilization at the intersection of literature and leadership. Welcome to the Leadership Lessons from the Great Books podcast.
Hello, my name is Hasan Sorrells, and this is the Leadership Lessons from the Great Books podcast, episode number 131. So there are a few authors that we cover on this podcast whose writing and observations about human nature, about geography, about time, space, character, all those important and awesome things that leaders should pay attention to when they're reading literature. We read an author whose observations about all these areas are so well embedded or so deeply embedded into our shared Western conscience that we don't take them into consideration at an intentional level. And during this time of year, during Christmas time, that's even more evident. The writer whose work, one of his works we will be examining today, wrote around 80 books. He wrote several hundred poems, some 200 short stories, 4,000 essays, mostly in the form of newspaper columns back in the day, and wrote several plays. He wrote in multiple genres, including detective fiction, journals, and wrote on apologetics, following in the footsteps or matching them depending upon your perspective, a fellow contemporary writer, C.S. Lewis, whose works we've covered on this podcast in episode number 61. Now, actually, he wasn't a contemporary of Lewis. He actually influenced Lewis, and didn't really live to see Lewis get to where it is he was going to wind up at. But Lewis even said about this writer that his work influenced him to move away from atheism and towards Christianity. This writer, known as the Prince of Paradox, has been identified by literary critics as a successor to authors of the Victorian era, such as Matthew Arnold, Thomas Carlyle, John Henry Newman, and the late, great John Ruskin. Today, you probably have already guessed who we're going to be talking about, but today we will be pulling or extracting leadership lessons for the holiday season and for the upcoming new year for leaders from The New Jerusalem, Theological Explorations in the Holy Land by G.K. Chesterton. Leaders, lay the cornerstone for those who come after you, or the stone you should have laid will be pushed atop you by the next generation and inevitably grind you down to powder. And so we pick up from The New Jerusalem, Theological Explorations of the Holy Land. We're going to open up this book, starting with chapter 1 and G.K. Chesterton's journey through the Holy Land. And I quote, "It was in the season of Christmas that I came out of my little garden in that field of the beeches between the Chilterns and the Thames and began to walk backwards through history to the place from which Christmas came. For it is often necessary to walk backwards, as a man on the wrong road goes back to a signpost to find the right road. The modern man is more like a traveler who has forgotten the name of his destination and has to go back whence he came, even to find out where he is going. That the world has lost its way, few will now deny, and it did seem to me that I found at last a sort of signpost of a singular and significant shape, and saw for a moment in my mind the true map of the modern wanderings. But whether I shall be able to say anything of what I saw, this story must show. I had said farewell to all my friends, or all to those with my own limited number of legs, and nothing living remained but a dog and a donkey. The reader will learn what a surprise that my first feeling of fellowship went out to the dog. I am well aware that I lay open my guard to a lunge of wit. The dog is rather like a donkey, or small caricature of one, with a large black head and long black ears, but in the mood of the moment there was rather a moral contrast than a pictorial parallel. For the dog did indeed seem to stand for home and everything I was leaving behind me, with reluctance, especially that season of the year. For one thing, he is named after Mr. Winkle, the Christmas guest of Mr. Wardle, and there is indeed something Dickensian in his union of domesticity with exuberance. He jumped about me, barking like a small battery, under the impression that I was going for a walk, but I could not, alas, take him with me on a stroll to Palestine. Incidentally, he would have been out of place, for dogs have not their due honor in the East, and this seemed to sharpen my sense of my own domestic sentinel as a sort of symbol of the West. On the other hand, the East is full of donkeys, often very dignified donkeys, and when I turned my attention to the other grotesque quadruped, with an even larger head and even longer ears, he seemed to take on a deep shade of oriental mystery. I know not why these two absurd creatures tangled themselves up so much in my train of thought, like dragons in an illuminated text, or rant like gargoyles on either side of the gateway of my adventure. But in truth, they were in some sense symbols of the West and the East after all. The dog's very lawlessness is but an extravagance of loyalty. He will go mad with joy 3 times in the same day at going out for a walk down the same road. The modern world is full of fantastic forms of animal worship, a religion generally accompanied with human sacrifice. Yet we hear strangely little of the real merits of animals, and one of them surely is this innocence of all boredom. Perhaps such simplicity is the absence of sin. I have some sense of myself of the sacred duty of surprise and the need of seeing the old road as a new road. But I cannot claim that whenever I go out for a walk with my family and friends, I rush in front of them, volleying vociferous shouts of happiness, or even leap up round them, attempting to lick their faces. It is in this power of beginning again with energy upon familiar and homely things that the dog is really the eternal type of the Western civilization, and the donkey is really as different as is the Eastern civilization. And it is such, with the comparison of donkeys and dogs, that we begin G.K. Chesterton's journey to the Holy Land sometime in the late 19th century. Gilbert Keith Chesterton was born May 29, 1874, and died June 14, 1936. He was an English author, philosopher, a Christian apologist, and a literary and art critic. By the way, all this information is taken from G.K. Chesterton's Wikipedia page. You can go check it out there. According to his autobiography, as a young man, he became fascinated with the occult, even though he was raised a Unitarian in a Unitarian household, and along with his brother Cecil, experimented with Ouija boards and trying to call up the dead. Much later in his life, as an adult, he married Frances Blogg in 1901. And the marriage, like most marriages of that era, lasted the rest of his life. Chesterton credited Frances with leading him back to Anglicanism, which is the outgrowth of, where Unitarianism came out of. And he later considered Anglicanism to be a pale imitation of genuine Christianity, and entered into full communion with the Catholic Church in 1922. By the way, just pause on this. It's interesting. Chesterton started out with a lukewarm Christianity that led him into the occult. And then when he was converted to Catholicism, he described himself as being Orthodox, and which is, again, sort of an interesting thing to think about. It is not the lukewarm things that attract folks. It is the robust theologies. Chesterton loved to debate, and he was the soul of wit, as you will see in some of the selection from his writing today. And he often engaged in friendly public disputes with such men as George Bernard Shaw, the noted socialist and Fabian, H.G. Wells, another noted Fabian and eugenicist, Bertrand Russell, the philosopher and socialist, and Clarence Darrow, the individual, the lawyer, who successfully engaged in the Scopes monkey trial, which solidified evolution as not a theory that could be taught in schools as a theory, but instead solidified evolution as the only fact of the land. Of his writing style, the magazine Time observed way back in the day that, quote, whenever possible, Chesterton made his points with popular sayings, proverbs, and allegories, first carefully turning them inside out. Thus, the appellation with which he was tagged, the Prince of Paradox. Chesterton has also been called, over the course of time, the Apostle of Common Sense. He was very critical of the thinkers and popular philosophers of his own day, who, though very clever, were saying things that he considered to be nonsensical. As a matter of fact, this is a guy who went out and got up after Oscar Wilde for saying what he considered to be nonsensical. The word we would use now would be stupid things. G.K. Chesterton did not tolerate fools, but he would tolerate an argument because he saw the argument as a way to convert the fool to believing in Christ. All right, so back to the book. Back to The New Jerusalem by G.K. Chesterton. So we're going to pick up a little bit later in chapter 1. He's talking about how he is traveling across Europe to his eventual destination in Palestine. And I quote, "And it was not until I had reached Rome that I adequately realized the next great reality that simplified the whole story, and even this particular part of the story. I know nothing more abruptly arresting than that sudden steepness as of streets scaling the sky where stands, now cased in tile and brick and stone, that small rock that rose and overshadowed the whole earth, the Capitol. Here, on the gray dawn of our history, sat the strong republic that set her foot upon the necks of kings, and it was from here assuredly that the spirit of the republic flew like an eagle to alight on that far-off pillar in the country of the Gauls. For it ought to be remembered, and it is too often forgotten, that if Paris inherited what may be called the authority of Rome, it is equally true that Rome anticipated all that is sometimes called the anarchy of Paris. The expansion of the Roman Empire was accompanied by a sort of permanent Roman revolution, fully as furious as the French Revolution. So long as the Roman system was really strong, it was full of riots and mobs and democratic divisions, and any number of Bastilles fell as the temple of the victories rose. But though I had but a hurried glance at such things, there were among them some that further aided the solution of the problem. I saw the larger achievements of the later Romans, and the lesson that was still lacking was plainly there. I saw the Colosseum, a monument of that love of looking on at athletic sports, which is noted as a sign of decadence in the Roman Empire and of energy in the British Empire. I saw the baths of Caracalla, witnessing to a cult of cleanliness, adduced also to prove the luxury of ancient Romans and the simplicity of Anglo-Saxons. All it really proves either way is a love of washing on a large scale, which might merely indicate that Caracalla, like other emperors, was a lunatic. But indeed, what such things do indicate, if only indirectly, is something which is here much more important. They indicate not only a sincerity in the public spirit, but a certain smoothness in the public services. In a word, while there were many revolutions, there were no strikes. The citizens were often rebels, but there were men who were not rebels because they were not citizens. The ancient world forced a number of people to do the work of the world first, before it allowed more privileged people to fight about the government of the world. The truth is trite enough, of course. It is in the single word, slavery, which is not the name of a crime like simony, but rather of a scheme like socialism, sometimes very like socialism. Well, I, for one, want to wish you a Merry Christmas. Feliz Navidad. Season's greetings. Happy holidays. But mostly, Merry Christmas. G.K. Chesterton, just like most committed Christian apologetics writers of his era in the late 19th and into the early 20th century, in that interesting bookend between the beginning of the horror of World War I, the pulling apart of Europe, and the rise of the Industrial Revolution, and the middle part of the 20th century with the rise of National Socialism and big government and big industry colluding together in the form of fascism. In that weird little bookend, right, where All Quiet on the Western Front was published, where C.S. Lewis began to do his best work, where J.R.R. Tolkien was trying to figure out exactly what happened in the trenches of Europe, G.K. Chesterton was the grand old man. G.K. Chesterton was sort of the gray pilgrim that led a number of writers during the Victorian era, including Matthew Arnold and others, led them into the brave new world of the 20th century. And in England, a brave new world where all of the lessons, particularly the wrong lessons, would be absorbed and learned and doubled down on in the form of socialism. We tend to think of socialism not in a Christian context because it has been so divorced from its Christian context of basically bringing the kingdom of God to earth that, well, we just don't think of it that way anymore, particularly in America. The American version of socialism is, of course, progressivism, which is owned primarily lock, stock, and two smoking barrels by the Democratic Party in America and has been for the last 120 some odd years. But don't get me wrong, there are many folks in the Republican Party in America who are just as progressive. Woodrow Wilson and Teddy Roosevelt both came from the same root and branch of wanting to remake man in man's own image and to throw Jesus out with the bathwater. But back to Chesterton. So Chesterton he rebelled against this idea of socialism, right, at a government level. He particularly rebelled against socialism as something that would have a biblical basis or something that would have a religious basis. And in our time, and where this relates to us listening to this potentially during the Christmas season, where this relates to us is that there are two fundamental views of Christianity and Christmas that one can take in our increasingly anti-Christian culture during this time of year. One view focuses on to paraphrase from Chesterton, the Dickensian secular focus on Santa and toys and food and tinsel, which I personally find to be distracting. The other view focuses around recognition, repentance, and reconciliation. This is the view that Chesterton and later on C.S. Lewis and many others would find is the view that they wanted to take. It is a view that really looks at the reason for the season and makes that more than just an interesting rhyme. There's a meme sometimes that shows up, and those of you who are not involved in the meme wars on the internet probably won't have ever seen this, but the image shows a man standing at a crossroads, and it says, "Which way, Western man?" Now, there's other variations of this meme, but the meme represents the truth of the fork in the road that exists for many people right now in the West, many average folks. Leaders and others are silently looking around at the culture and they are making choices about which fork in the road they are going to go down here at the end of the fourth turning. Because we are at a fork in the road, and Chesterton would say, wisely, I believe, that we have been at this fork before, and we have made the wrong decision before. And he would say that it is in the providence of the Lord, Jesus, that we are given another opportunity to make a different choice.
Hello. So I'm going to do some shilling here, and hopefully this will be a pause in our riveting conversation for you. I have an offer for you. My most recent book is 12 Rules for Leaders, The Foundation of Intentional Leadership. It's available in paperback, hardcover, or as an ebook on Amazon, Barnes & Noble, Kobo, and any other place you order books. Now, in this book, I address the 12 leadership areas that I have found leaders need to be the most intentional in to be the type of leader followers actually want to follow. From establishing a foundation of leading teams through managing conflict effectively, all the way through leading teams through change, knowing what to do and why to do it can help readers, like the ones listening to this show, become better leaders. Look, reading this book and living it is like getting coaching from me directly without having to pay my full coaching rate. Head on over to leadershiptoolbox.us, that's leadershiptoolbox.us, and scroll down the homepage and click on the Buy Now button to purchase in hardcover, paperback, and Kindle format on Amazon 12 Rules for Leaders, the foundation for intentional leadership. And that's it for me. Now back to the show.
Back to the book. Back to the New Jerusalem by G.K. Chesterton. Now, I have an open source copy of the New Jerusalem that was where the text was laid out in the UK. And the text itself, or not the text was laid out in the UK, sorry. The text was originally published in the UK in 1920. This book was originally published in 1920. And the edits and the layouts were made in 2024, almost 100 years, a little over 100 years later. This book is in public domain, so you can find this other places across the internet, across the interwebs, such as it were. And it's well worth your time to pick it up. So we're going to go into Chapter 2, The Way of the Desert. And I quote, "It may be truly said, touching the type of culture at least, that Egypt has an Egyptian lower class, a French middle class, and an English governing class. Anyhow, it is true that the civilizations are stratified in this formation or superimposed in this order. It is the first impression produced by the darkness and density of the bazaars, the line of the lighted cafes, and the blaze of the big hotels, but it contains a much deeper truth in all three cases, and especially in the case of the French influence. It is indeed one of the first examples of what I mean by the divisions of the West becoming clearer in the ancient centers of the East. It is often said that we can only appreciate the work of England in a place like India. Insofar as this is true, it is quite equally true that we can only appreciate the work of France in a place like Egypt. But this work is of a peculiar and even paradoxical kind. It is too practical to be prominent, and so universal that it is unnoticed. The French view of the rights of man is called visionary, but in practice it is very solid and even prosaic. The French have a unique and successful trick by which French things are not accepted as French. They are accepted as human. However many foreigners played football, they would still consider football an English thing. But they do not consider fencing a French thing, although in terms of it are still probably French. If a Frenchman were to label his hostelry an inn or a public house, probably written publicus, we should think him a victim of a rather advanced Anglomania. But when an Englishman calls it a hotel, we feel no special dread of him either as a dangerous foreigner or as a dangerous lunatic. We need not recognize less readily the value of this because our own distinction is different, especially as our own distinction is being more distinguished. The spirit of the English is adventure, and it is the essence of adventure that the adventurer does remain different from the strange tribes or strange cities, which he studies because of their strangeness. He does not become like them, as did some of the Germans, or persuade them to become like him, as do most of the French. But whether we like or dislike this French capacity or merely appreciate it properly in its place, there can be no doubt about the cause of that capacity. The cause is in the spirit that is so often regarded as wildly utopian and unreal. The cause is in the abstract creed of equality and citizenship, in the possession of a political philosophy that appeals to all men. In truth, men have never looked low enough for the success of the French Revolution. They have assumed that it claims to be a sort of divine and distant thing, and therefore have not noticed it in the nearest and most materialistic things. They have watched its wavering in the Senate and never seen it walking in the streets, though it can be seen in the streets of Cairo as in the streets of Paris. That is an excellent point, and I'm going to flip through this and go to another point that he makes in regards to, well, the people inhabiting Egypt, the Muslim majority. And I quote, "I speak here of the Muslim type of religion and not of the Oriental type of ornament, which is much older than the Muslim type of religion. But even the Oriental type of ornament, admirable as it often is to the ornament of a Gothic cathedral what a fossil forest is to a forest full of birds. In short, the man of the desert tends to simplify too much and to take his first truth for the last truth. And as it is with religion, so it is with morality. He who believes in the existence of God believes in the equality of man. And it has been one of the merits of the Muslim faith that it felt men as men and was not incapable of welcoming men of many different races. But here again, it was so hard and crude that its very equality was like a desert rather than a field. Its very humanity was inhuman." The Jerusalem of our imaginations and of our imaginings in the West has long since passed from myth into legend and has now transmorgified into something else in the 21st century. For religious people, for people who take a more religious view of the holiday of Christmas, traveling or pilgrimaging to the Holy Land is a critical step in their faith process. I will admit, even I have considered taking on such a trip. The challenge in our time, though, is the same one that existed in Chesterton's time, in the tumultuous decades after the close of World War I. The reality that they lived in is the same reality we live in now, just with, cell phones and computers to get us the information of the reality a heck of a lot quicker than newspapers and steamships and cables could. There is a reality of the Middle East that is a reality of war and strife, bloodshed, conflict, and colonialization by a non-Christian presence in the space where Jesus walked, where Jesus slept, where Jesus ate, and even where Jesus died and was resurrected. This challenge exists now and will probably exist until Jesus returns. Suffice it to say, how do we resolve this challenge? How do we resolve these threads? How do we take the Jerusalem of our imaginings that we want to pilgrimage to that does not exist in the reality of Jerusalem and the reality of the Middle East now? How do we take these two competing ideas, these two competing tensions, and resolve them? Well, those tensions must be resolved. And if they can't be resolved, which I don't know that they can successfully be resolved, I only know that they exist. I have no answer to this question. Unfortunately, for a podcast that seeks to solve problems, I cannot solve this one. So, since this can't be solved, how do we deal with these tensions? Well, we must become comfortable with ambiguity and disjointedness and confusion. And the reason we must become comfortable with ambiguity and disjointedness and confusion, the reason we must become comfortable with the reality of the Jerusalem as it exists now in the world, not the Jerusalem of our imaginings or our myths or our legends that are come down to us in the New Testament. The reason we have to become comfortable with that is because that level of comfortability with the problem, with the challenge, with the tension, that level of comfortability is going to allow us to lay successfully a cornerstone for the next generations, for what they need to do potentially in order to solve the most sticky problem of the last 2,000 years. So here at the end of our very brief coverage of The New Jerusalem by G.K. Chesterton, and I would love to get somebody else on to talk about this book because there's a ton of stuff in here that needs to be explored. His observations of the Holy Land, his theological explorations of Islam, how Islam, Christianity, and Judaism all merge together, and of course what the meaning of Jerusalem is as a Christian and what meaning we should take from it beyond that which is offered us in the New Testament. All these things are covered in The New Jerusalem by G.K. Chesterton. I would encourage you to check out and read his journeys through Israel. But we only have a limited amount of time today, and you only have a limited amount of attention. So what are we to gain from just the first couple of chapters from Chesterton, and of course from Chesterton's life, and how do we think about ourselves and positioning of ourselves at the end of this tumultuous year of 2024? Well, I'd like to start off with something basic from Psalm 118, verse 22. The stone which the builders refused or rejected is become the headstone of the corner. Or in some translations, the stone that the builders rejected has become the cornerstone. We see this in Mark, and we see this in Luke, I believe, as well, talking about, referring to Jesus' presence in the world. How do we, though, as individuals here, close to the end of the fourth turning, and I do believe we are close to the end of the fourth turning here at the end of 2024. We've explored this concept all year here on the podcast. If you don't know what the fourth turning is, go back and listen to some other episodes or just Google fourth turning. I do fundamentally believe that we have turned a corner. We just, well, it's like when you get a little bit too much to drink, right? Too much wine or too much scotch or too much hard cider, and you wake up the next day and you have a hangover. We're about to go through, I think, a 4-year hangover from our fourth turning, but on the other side of that, we will be healthy, we will be wealthier, and we will be infinitely wiser. The question, of course, on a leadership podcast is who will lead us through this last bit of the fourth turning and shepherd in a new high, a new seculum spring. Well, the first thing that we have to do, the first thing that any leader has to do when shepherding folks, is we have to figure out where to lay the cornerstone and what the cornerstone will be so that it doesn't fall on us and we get ground to powder. I believe fundamentally the nomads of the 13th generation, Generation X, are starting to lead and to lay the foundations and the cornerstones without expectations of a thank you or appreciation from those who will come after. We are going to be a forgotten generation, folks. If you're between the ages of 45 and 59, I hate to be the bearer of bad news because we're all a bunch of nice people. And I hate giving nice people bad news, but we will be forgotten. We will not be remembered. The millennials, of course, will be remembered, and the baby boomers, of course, will be remembered, and Gen Z will be remembered based on volume of numbers, but we will not be remembered. And so it is our job to do the thankless task of laying the cornerstone for the first turning, for the next high. hard decisions, tough consequences, and a commitment to ruthlessly moving forward in spite of whatever may be currently in front of our faces are the benchmarks along the way to the next historical high. Chesterton, by the way, would approve of that. He would like it that he has been forgotten. It's time to go back to the future and begin to do the work of laying that foundation for the next world that we will not inhabit. It's time to go back and reach into these books by Chesterton and by Lewis, by Reinhold Niebuhr, and by others, and to pull out those hoary old ideas, polish them off, mold them together, mash them up, such as it were, and come up with something new. And the 13th generation, the nomad generation, Gen X, the oh well, whatever, never mind generation, is poised right now to do this work. Who will lead us, though? Who will encourage us? Who will get out of our way? Who will be the bulldozer that will move all of the obstacles that we are either too feckless or too passive-aggressive or too bored or too disinterested to move ourselves? Well, I think, just as we have at the end of every fourth turning, I think we have a pilgrim that has appeared on the horizon. Now, usually, the pilgrim is gray. But in our time, here at the end of the fourth turning, history laughs, just like God. And it turns out that maybe, potentially, our pilgrim might not be gray, but he might be orange. Something to think about. And well, that's it for me.
Thank you for listening to the Leadership Lessons from the Great Books podcast today. And now that you've made it this far, you should subscribe to the audio version of this show on all the major podcast players, including Apple iTunes, Spotify, YouTube Music, and everywhere else where podcasts are available. There's also a video version of our podcast on our YouTube channel. Like and subscribe to the video version of this podcast on the Leadership Toolbox channel on YouTube. Just search for Leadership Toolbox and hit the subscribe button there on YouTube. And while you're doing that, leave a 5-star review if you like what we're doing here on Apple, Spotify, and YouTube. Just go below the player and hit 5 stars. We need those reviews to grow, and it's the easiest way to help grow this show. And tell all your friends, of course, in leadership. By the way, if you don't like what we're doing here, well, you can always listen to another leadership show. There are several other good ones out there. At least that's what I've heard. All right. Well, that's it for me.